And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. The porcupine is a priculus of rodents, although its Latin name means quill pig. There are more than 24 porcupine species, and all boast a coat of needle-like quills to give predators a sharp reminder that this animal is no easy meal. On today's Open Connection, we open our archives to bring you this story from 1990.
John Krebs is trying to learn all he can about porcupines. He's taking part in a 5-year study to gather biological data on porcupines in northwest forests, their numbers and densities, their favorite habitats, their reproductive patterns, their movements, and especially porcupine eating habits. Because the porcupine's healthy appetite is destroying a great many northwest conifer trees, and foresters want to know how to stop the destruction.
From what I've seen, one porky can pretty much do in a tree in a night, potentially, but I think what happens also is they go back to the same trees for a few nights. So I don't know, it's somewhere between probably 40 to 100 stems they have potential to damage per winter, per porcupine.
At up to 100 trees per creature per year, the Kalem Valley north of Terrace is one of the most severely porcupine-damaged areas in the Northwest. The more you look, the more you notice the conifer trees with their bark stripped by the hungry porcupines. In some timber stands, almost half the trees have been attacked.
We can't afford to lose that. That's a major part of the forest area in the Kalem timber supply area. We figure there's about 50,000 hectares of our second growth stands that are at risk. And the actual area of damage, it's scattered throughout that whole 50,000 hectares. And there's some hot spots. There's some areas that have been really affected. Erlinson Creek, Deep Creek, in the Kalem area.
The Kalem Valley is not the only area hard hit by the porcupines in the Northwest. In the Kutsumatine Inlet, north of Prince Rupert, damage is also extensive. The forests of the Kutsumatine Inlet and the Kalem Valley share some common characteristics. Both areas were logged 30 to 40 years ago. Both areas are highly productive forest lands, and the second-generation trees are a substantial size. And in both areas, too many of those trees are being lost to porcupines. From a distance, the forests look healthy and robust, a thick layer of conifers covering the ground. But some foresters call it the green lie. The health of many trees is not what it appears.
Well, it varies quite significantly across the Kutsumatine Inlet, but generally, in some pockets we find 100% damage. Virtually no stem has been left unchewed by the porcupine, and in other areas is down to 15 to 20%. The impact, of course, is how much more will occur over the next 40 years, and that's what worries us.
Mike LaRock is a silviculture officer for the Forest Service. He says losing even 10% of the trees to porcupines is a significant loss.
It is, certainly, because that 15-20% are the tallest, the best trees. The porcupine goes up in the tops of the trees to get the freshest growth, plus to get sunlight. So those are the trees we don't want to lose.
So the porcupine actually takes the dominant trees?
Mm-hmm. Dominant and co-dominant are the preferred.
Even more significant to foresters is the tree loss compounds itself every year. So at the end of the 80-year rotation life of the forest, there could, conceivably, be very few trees left to harvest.
The problem that we see is that through our surveys, we've found that there's about 1% of the trees are attacked each year. And on a single year, that's only 1% isn't particularly significant. But if you add that up over 10 years or 20 years, you've got 10 and 20% of the trees that are attacked, and they won't. Most of those trees are killed.
So over the rotation of a forest?
Over the rotation, we could lose the majority of the trees.
From the ground, from in amongst the trees, the damage becomes readily apparent. In some stands, every tree has been gnawed upon by the porcupines. They eat the tree's cambium layer, the fleshy underside of the bark that carries nutrients between the roots and the needles. If the porcupine chews completely around the tree, that is, if it girdles the bark, the tree will die, strangled of nutrients. But even if the tree survives the stripping of its protective outer skin, the open wounds are entry points for fungus and disease that can attack and cripple the tree, stunting its growth and ruining much of its commercial value.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. The porcupine feeds largely on the inner bark of trees in winter, but will also feed on a variety of other plants. Let us return to the archives with Forester Resource Officer Bill Jackson.
What we're looking at here is the original damage on this particular stem. It's probably about 7 to 10 years ago that it happened. And what's done is it's killed the top of the original tree. And then the tree trying to heal itself, it hasn't, the whole tree hasn't died. And what's happened is that the lateral branches are now taking off and growing up to become the main shoot. So what you get is a totally damaged stem that's taken up space in the stand here, and yet it's totally worthless. It'll never be good for anything. This is access for decays and rots in these old feeding areas, and yet the tree's still here, still taking up space from other trees that might make it.
So even though it's not completely dead, it's worthless?
It's worthless. Totally useless. It'll never make another crop tree.
The second growth forests of the Kutsumateen and Kalem valleys represent a significant investment to the forest industry. It costs a lot of money to get a conifer to harvestable size. There's planting and brushing and spacing costs. But more importantly, the forest industry is counting on these forests for logging in the next 30 to 40 years. In fact, the annual allowable cut, the amount of timber we're cutting today, is based on future growth projections from these second stand forests. If those projections are wrong, if there's less wood to cut because of the porcupine damage, it will increase the likelihood of a log shortage in the future.
No, it's a significant investment right now, and right now we're counting on it in terms of what we harvest every year. These areas producing in another 40 years. So basically our annual cut depends on these areas.
Needless to say, the Forest Ministry wants to reduce the porcupine damage, and the most direct way is by reducing their population. Bill Jackson is carrying a special cargo aboard the skiff he's piloting to a quiet beach on the Kutsumateen Inlet. In the cages are 2 fishers, a voracious predator. The fisher is a larger cousin of the weasel. The fisher is one of the porcupine's only natural enemies. The Forest Service is trying to establish the fishers in the Kutsumateen to control the porcupine population. These fishers come from the Houston-Burns Lake area. They've been purchased from trappers for $500 each, but forest officials say they'll be well worth the price if the sleek predators can knock back the porcupine numbers.
Hey, Harry. What's that, he said? Well, he's not in a hurry at all.
I know that porcupines have some quite a good natural defensive system, as it were. How does a fisher get around that?
They, one thing about it, the quills don't affect the fisher. The quills, they've done autopsies on over 2,000 fisher, and they found quills through the liver. They found them through the whole intestinal tract, under the skin, everywhere, and there's no ill effects. It doesn't seem to bother the fisher at all. So if they do get quilled, it doesn't seem to hurt them. But their main way of attacking the porcupine, apparently, is that they go at the face, and they will claw and bite the face until the porcupine basically weakens with loss of blood and that, and then they, of course, just kill them from there.
Because the porcupine's face is unprotected.
Yeah, yeah.
A few kilometers further along the inlet, the second fisher is released. So far, the Forest Service has released 8 fishers in the Cootsamatine. The program is relatively new, so it's still not certain if it's having an effect on porcupine numbers.
Is there any danger that a fisher from, say, the interior south of Houston won't adapt to these coastal environs?
Animals being animals, there's always a danger of that. And talking to the biologists, they say there is probably a percentage that will pack up and head back. These fisher, we've kept them around purposely for a period of time in order to get them adapted to this area. And hopefully they'll be more inclined to stick around.
And what about, if there's so many porcupines around here, wouldn't the fisher population naturally just kind of increase to go after them, the ones that are here?
The ones we've released up until now, though, there's been no fisher in this area. Whether there was prior years and what happened to them, we're not sure. But this is what we call a reintroduction program of fisher. They're non-existent on the coast right at this time. So we're trying to get a population established, a breeding population, so they will expand from here and hopefully cover more of the coast. Yeah.
Later, on an overgrown Cootsamatine logging road, the remains of a porcupine are found. It's not proof, but it may be an indication the fishers are feeding on the target prey. Along with the introduction of the fishers, the Forest Ministry is also investigating other methods of porcupine control in the Cootsamatine. In a test area, some of the trees have been collared with a sheet of metal to stop the porcupines from climbing them.
Well, this represents the extreme. What could we do that would lessen the impact of the porcupine damage and sustain the trees until they reach a merchantable size? We spaced the area and collared our crop trees, basically in this area.
And that was just to try to save those trees that you thought would have a better chance of getting to market size?
That's right. It's trying to push the pressure from the porcupine onto other stems that we don't necessarily want, and keep them off those trees that we want to be able to harvest in 40 years.
Have you any indication of whether it's working or not?
Yes, this is the second winter that we've come in and monitored it, and certainly our suspicions hold true. The majority of the feeding is within the leave areas, the areas where we want the porcupine to stay. And he's along the fringe, which means he enjoys being in the sunlight. So far he's cooperating.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. Wildlife bounties have a long, complicated history in wildlife management. In the early 20th century, many game management agencies commonly placed bounties on predators to protect domestic livestock and restore plummeting game populations. Let us return to the archives to discover an alternative to placing bounties on porcupine.
A direct method is a bounty on the creatures. Some $15,000 was paid out in the past year to trappers who killed 500 porcupines in the terrace area. A longer-term, less direct method of porcupine control might be found in silvicultural practices, in the way the forests are managed. It appears porcupines prefer some species of evergreen over others. Selective species planting could help alleviate the damage.
Well, right now the areas that we're harvesting, and any areas that the devastation has been so great, we have to start over, basically. And those new areas that are being harvested, we're trying to increase the species composition of cedar and balsam, which we don't find as much chewing on balsam, and we haven't seen any on cedar. However, they have their own cultural problems. So balsam being, it's hard to germinate, and it's hard to get into a seedling. There's still some nursery development in that area, and cedar is a favorite deer browse. So although it's an answer, it's not the silver bullet.
The porcupine problem in Northwest forests is not a new phenomenon. It was recognized as long as 10 years ago. But foresters say it's been getting steadily worse. There seems to be more and more of the prickly tree eaters. Not a great deal is known about the biological cycle of North Coast porcupines. They're said to be mostly nocturnal, although they do move around during the day. A mating pair apparently produces only one offspring a year, but some trappers say they've seen them with several young. To learn more about the porcupines, the Forest Ministry is paying for a $125,000 5-year study to find out how many there are and how fast they're multiplying, the extent of their range, their seasonal food sources, and if they really do prefer some types of trees over others.
We want to follow the over time to find out maybe it's a short-term attack. Maybe they'll come in for a couple of years and then bugger off, and then they'll still have enough stems per hectare to make a decent volume. But on the other hand, since you have less to begin with, yeah, as you say, you'll end up with below stocking levels that won't be what they're looking for in the next crop.
Studying porcupines is not a simple endeavor. There are certain inherent dangers in dealing with a so well-protected creature. They've also been more difficult to trap than anticipated. More often than not, the traps set for the porcupines are found empty. And that means using more direct methods of capture, such as climbing into the trees, armed with leather gloves and a large fish net, and sort of wrestling the porcupines into the net. Once safely netted and on the ground, the captured porcupines are further immobilized with the injection of a tranquilizer. They're then weighed, measured, tagged, and fitted with the radio-transmitting collars so their movements can be more easily tracked.
It's good that they're going about it. Like having us do the study is great, I think, because then instead of just going out and saying, okay, we got to kill all the porcupines, we got to first sort of go, okay, well, how should we go about this first? Let's get some information, do a little research, even though it doesn't pay off immediately. Like tomorrow, I can't tell you the answer, but at least we'll have something to guide the policies by in the future, I think. Because the stand tending, all the spacing that goes on, it's really costly. Like it's about $800,000 per hectare to space an area, and so if you're going to go ahead with that, it's wise to find out what you're in for if you're going to make that a policy for all these stands.
While foresters look for methods to control the burgeoning porcupine numbers, it's ironic that the population growth may be a direct result of the foresters' own management practices. Our logging and silvicultural techniques may be the cause of the problem.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
British Columbia is Canada's most ecologically diverse province. It has everything from temperate rainforests to alpine meadows to desert. It is also the country's most biologically diverse province. In this final segment of Open Connection, we discover how logging may have helped the porcupine expand westward.
Yeah, I think what they do is in young stands, or like say after a fire when there's a young stand, that's their traditional habitat. Like they weren't really a very coastal animal until we came in, because effectively we've sort of mimicked fire in a way by logging and then making these young stands here, which are good habitat for them.
Another silvicultural practice that may be exacerbating the damage problem is tree spacing. Many stands have been thinned, with smaller trees cut down, so others have less competition and can grow faster. But this may have only forced the porcupines to concentrate their feeding on the remaining trees, in effect further spacing an already thinned forest, which could mean there won't be as many stems per hectare as we're counting on for future harvest.
And some people have said that the porcupines are doing some of our thinning forests, but unfortunately what they do is they'll attack all of the trees in one area, so they'll clean out an entire patch. Not as though, it's not like thinning where you maybe cut every second tree down or something like that.
Dealing with the porcupines has been a somewhat prickly problem for the Forest Ministry. Some people are especially critical of the bounty program, saying it's not the mandate of the Forest Ministry to implement animal bounties. But porcupines, it turns out, sit in a sort of bureaucratic void. They're one of the few species not protected as wildlife under current legislation. So any government agency can institute its own porcupine control measures, sort of management by default. However, legislative measures are now being considered to change that.
I think that they're going to become, it's going to be more difficult to, say, introduce a bounty or something in the future with when they recognize all species, wildlife species, whether they're hunted or not, as a legitimate or a protected species or under the Act. So yeah, I think there has been a bit of a loophole so far.
But regardless of which government ministry has jurisdiction over porcupine management, biologist Krebs questions whether a bounty is effective as a population control tool.
I personally think that the doing a direct bounty type approach isn't systematic enough, so you're not going to really eliminate them over any one area. You're just going to take little pieces here and there, and so that I don't think is really viable in the way that it's sort of traditionally been carried out.
And Forest Service officials concede the effectiveness of the porcupine bounty program is still being assessed.
Exactly. We'll look at these areas again. We'll look at the areas where the porcupine populations have been reduced, as compared to the areas where there's still all the porcupines are still there, and hopefully where we've reduced the population, we've also reduced the damage.
And what about the effectiveness of the fisher release program in the Coot-Samateen? The Forest Service is having trouble buying enough fishers to successfully stock the Coot-Samateen Valley, and even then, it's not certain the fishers will have the desired effect.
So this fisher introduction is kind of untested.
Yeah, it's not been directly correlated. It hasn't been shown that if you introduce, if you have a population of porkies and you introduce fisher, then it hasn't been shown that those densities will decrease directly.
And then there's always the danger that comes whenever mankind tries to manage nature. The possibility the fragile ecological balance that exists between all plants and animals in the forest might be tipped by removing the porcupine component, causing some later unforeseen biological consequences.
Yeah, you don't know. You don't know what, they're not very well studied, as you say, and what exact role they have, like in creating the forest or whatever, maintaining it. Yeah, maybe if you do get rid of them, you lose something, but I think most people would like to get rid of them, as, from what I can tell.
Krebs may be right. Because of the value of the forest industry, most people in the Northwest may want to reduce porcupine numbers. Perhaps it's more a question of to what degree and how. The answer will very likely be found in a combination of methods, a program involving bounties, metal tree collars, and predator introduction. But along with those measures, there may also have to be a change in the type of forest planted. Porcupines, it seems, prefer some tree species more so than others. So instead of planting so much hemlock and spruce, we may have to start planting more cedar and balsam.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind to his heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.